Thank you for coming to our quilt show. I am Sandra Lafke Carlson. I am the historian here, and but there were a lot of people helping to set this up and to loan their quilts today. And but I want to say especially April Wicker and Eleanor Micus, who helped plan this event. And so there'll be about 5 of us today who are going to be talking about the quilts here. Eleanor is going to start, and she's going to tell us a little about the history of quilting and some anecdotes about quilts, and we're all going to talk out loud so everybody can hear.
All right. I did do a history of quilting. I went back to 3,000 years before Christ in China. But before that, I started thinking about the fact that my family, we were not quilters. So I really don't have anything from grandparents or anything. My grandmother that I remember, the one that lived on a farm, she had this big feather thing that she put on the bed. I'm thinking that it was made out of, the covering was made out of feed sacks, white, with maybe printing. I still have some, in fact. I don't know what they came from. But that's my background. So I started, and it's been quite a journey. So looking back to China, who, if maybe we've all seen in our history and geography books, the warriors back in the day, they had these quilted jackets and vests, and they were actually like armor for them because they didn't have bullets back then, so they could protect them from the weapons of the day. But coming forward on that, they did find remnants of a quilt in Mongolia, and they also found a piece of a quilted shoe along the Silk Road. And I'm wondering, how in the world did these things survive over the centuries? Because that was a mighty long time ago. Ancient Egyptians also had quilts. They found actually pictorial things or carvings in rocks or whatever showing this quilt. And right now, the oldest quilts in existence, there are 3, and they're called the Tristan quilts. And they're really interesting. I saw photos of them and couldn't bring it, the way they quilted figures. And that's what their quilting method was. And they're called the Tristan quilts because we're at the time of Tristan and Isolde. Remember the names, don't know anything about them. But they're in museums in Europe, so they're still in existence. So our country, fast forward centuries to our country, and that started around the time of the pioneers in the 17 and 1800s, which I think we're a little more familiar with the quilts of those times. And mainly it was used by the wealthy ladies who, when they would retire to their little rooms and their needles and their tapestry or whatever they were doing, but they were quilting more to express their artistic side of them, because let's face it, women didn't for years have things like that. So they would take cut pieces of fabric, a design maybe out of a piece of fabric, and they would applique it on some other cloth. And that was the way that they started out. But then we moved into the time where they invented the cotton gin. And fabric at that time started to come down in price, and most people could afford it. So they were able to use the fabric to make the quilts. So that was 1794. Back in the day, we all know, I know that the Pole Center has had, I don't know if they still do, the ladies who get together and they hand quilt. And so they had quilting bees, and of course, some of the ladies, they used that as a social time. And they all would gather together, and then they'd gossip or whatever you do during that time, and just share stories among them. So today, it's more where we have guilds. And the ladies get together. I'm in one. I know that some of the people, they do belong to the guilds. And we get together for meetings once a month and then share ideas on quilts. And also have our little social time. And we have programs, we have guest speakers. They're just fascinating. The people, the way they take off on the different types of quilting. So we also have sit and sew days and retreats. Now this is something you go away for 3 or 4, maybe even a week, and that's all you do is quilt. So this is modern day. Now we've got a lot of different groups that put their name and stamp on quilts, and you may have all heard of Amish quilts. And then there's I think it's pronounced Geesben, Gee's. This was like some revelation maybe about 10 or 15 years ago in Alabama. A man, I guess he's riding around on the back roads, and he saw these unique quilts that were hanging from clotheslines or fences or wherever. And the way it was arranged really caught his eye. And these ladies, they would use every little scrap. They'd pick up clothing along the side of the road as long as they could cut out pieces from that. And it's primarily the African American or black folks that do that. So they made quite a splash, and they actually started a movement so that they could put quilts in museums and have it be art instead of just this homely little thing that women do. So that was another one. Then you probably have all heard about the underground quilts, and this is where the Underground Railroad, and this is where back in the Civil War days, they said that they would hang them on fences or clothesline and direct the people who were escaping slavery. And that's supposed to be debunked, that it's not really true, it didn't happen. I think it did. I really do. I think every quilt has a message. Many quilts have them, just the way they can design them and arrange the various patterns and blocks. So that's just the way I feel. And of course the flour sack quilts, many of the flour sacks were patterned, printed, had flowers on them and everything, and you could cut the pieces out and make your quilt. And today we have modern quilts, lots of white. And it kind of, seeing some of these and how much white is used back in the day, I think we went full circle on them, and now we're back to using the white again, because they use a lot in the modern ones. When it comes to the detail on the quilts, all of these little prints, it's blocks that are forming the quilt. Not always. There's some examples of whole cloth. This is a little one over here. Not whole cloth, but the whole design on it. But these are all blocks, and they come up with some really cute words for some of them, like courthouse steps, bear claw. That makes a pretty cute quilt, though. Full square. And then there's star patterns, which I thought was going to be really hard to learn, and it's nothing. It's just all in how you cut. So, and put the pieces together. The Ohio Star and the Sawtooth Star, a couple of the designs, but there's many. Missouri Star, all different kinds. One of the early ones, really early, was the log cabin quilt. And I see that April did a little bit of a version on the log cabin quilt, but that was imitating the way a log cabin was built, with the thin strips going around a circle. And in the center was a red, they always would feature a red block right in the middle of that quilt. And that meant the heart of the home. So very warm touch. Hand sewing, hand quilting, probably a thing of the past. The sewing machine was invented in the 1800s, and that sure did open up a lot of freedom for women to have a little more speed at doing all this quilting. Could really get a quilt done in no time rather than the stitch in time. And I said I was going to mention this because that old saying, a stitch in time saves 9. Well, it's because the quilters would do 9 inches, 9 stitches to an inch. And so when teaching somebody, they said, well, if you take your time and you do your 9 stitches, then you won't have to rip them out and start all over again. So stitch in time saves 9. Thought that was kind of cute. But that hasn't stopped tearing out stitches. I mean, April's saying no. So we're still ripping, and we've got special things. I know that I did early on, if I had to rip stitches, use the tip of a needle. Or maybe I happen to have truly surgical scissors, really sharp, and I ripped that. But no, today they have special tools that you can get to rip the stitches, and it makes it a lot easier. So this is what I learned on my little journey finding out about that, and really glad that I'm in the quilting community and fellowship and getting to know all the people that are involved in it. Thank you.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a quilt that was recently donated to the Historical Society, and it's up here. And this quilt was made by Rosa Castile, who was a prominent member of the Tualatin community, I think for decades. And she made a lot of quilts, and she supervised a lot of quilting bees. And we have someone here who's going to tell us a little more about that. But this quilt was donated by one of Rosa's great-granddaughters, Deborah Cole. And she lives now in Central Oregon. She couldn't be here today. But she said she's so happy to know that this quilt has a home here, because this building, her great-grandmother Rosa spent a lot of time in this building, and so this is a home for it now. And we also have a granddaughter of Rosa's who is visiting today, Jerry Bishop, and Jerry has a quilt that is hanging in the corner. And Jerry, would you tell us a little more about Rosa and about this quilt?
Good afternoon. My name is officially Jerry Lou Andrews Bishop. I go by Jerry Bishop. I am the daughter of Kenneth and Evelyn Andrews, and granddaughter of Rosa Castile and Harvey Castile, and great-granddaughter of Rosa Story and William Juergens. Now, I'm just going to tell you a little bit of history. Rosie Story, immigrated from Bohemia when I think she was just not very old, and she brought a chest with her. I think it's more of a chest than a dresser, and it is still in our family today, in bad shape, but it's still in the family. I think my oldest sister, Myrna Summers, her daughter, has it. Rosie spoke no English, and she met William Juergens, who spoke no Bohemian. And they fell in love, and they got married in Portland in, according to me, 1869, and there was an interpreter that did the wedding for them. So that would have been an interesting honeymoon, I think. So William and Rosa had 10 children, and Rosie Juergens was one of their girls. That was my grandmother. She married Harvey Castile, and they had 4 daughters: Bella Barnes, Evelyn Andrews, my mother, Callie Castile, who was born crippled and had to be carried and hand-fed. She died sometime around, I'm not sure, around maybe 10. She wasn't very old. There's a picture that she might show you later. Arlene Stites was the last daughter in that family, so they had 4 girls. Rose's, we always called her Grandma Rose. Grandpa Harvey, her husband, was a logger, and he built his family a little tiny house to live in, and they would go from Vernonia to St. Helens to who knows where, logging. And when the trees were gone, when they were through, the men would pick up the house. I don't know how many families lived there doing this, but they'd pick up the house and put it on the railroad car or track or something and pull it to the next logging town. And my mother just absolutely loved that. She thought that was the best thing to do. And finally, he was not able to do that. I think part of his hand was cut off, and his father, his father owned some property up just past, used to be Donut Land, or down from the high school in that area, and gave him some property. And so they built a fairly nice house, a 2-story house there, and lived there next to his father and mother. And then Grandpa Harvey became a caregiver. It said Lake Grove or Lake Oswego Country Club. And I don't know if he ever worked here at the Tualatin Country Club or not. Now, Grandma Rose was very, very active in the community, but she was also a midwife, and she delivered more babies than the doctor ever did. All 10 of us moms, Evelyn Andrews, all 10 of her babies were born at Grandma's. 7 girls and 3 boys. Grandma Rose was also president of the Ladies' Aid Society through the Methodist Church, which is this church, which makes me really emotional to walk in here. This is the same building, the same church that she would take us. If we spent the night there, she would take us and we would clean the church. And that was a lot of fun. But she also, if we were there on a Saturday night, she would take us to church. And that's where I first learned about Jesus. And I still remember, I'm sure, that there was a small room up top in the church that we would go up a very small stair. And there was a small room up there where we would have Sunday school. And I think Don Sylvie was a teacher. Okay, that's what I remember. And the other thing I really remember about the church was walking down steep stairs to the smell of perking coffee, because that's where they had their potlucks and all their socials. So that was a special time. Now, my sister Eileen, who is 3 years older than I am, 2.5, was married in this Methodist church in 1959. And as was her custom, Grandma made her a quilt, a wedding quilt. But just shortly after Bobby was married, they were moving, and the moving van had an accident and everything burned, and that quilt burned. And so my mother dug around in a chest she had and pulled this out. I honestly, until I looked at this for a few minutes, didn't remember seeing it. But it was Mom's, and she gave it to Bobby, Eileen, to replace the one that burned. And Bobby and I, Eileen, have been talking. We all have boys' names. We've been talking, and we think, okay, so Mom was married at 16. I doubt Grandma had a quilt made before she got married for her wedding. She wasn't expecting that. So Grandma gave this to my mother. And we don't know whether she made it after Mom was married or whether she had it. And so we're not really sure how old it is. My mother died at 92, age 92, in 2006. My sister Eileen thinks that this is probably fairly close to 100 years old. But it's in a lot better shape than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was not going to look near this good. And then when I got married to my husband, Dick Bishop, back there with a blue shirt, we got married in 1960, and we just celebrated our 62nd wedding anniversary this summer. But unfortunately, Grandma Rose died a few months after our wedding. And so I have 3 sisters, Betty, Linda, and Judy. Well, there's 7 of us, but that never received a precious wedding quilt from Betty, and I feel really sorry for them. Now, Grandma Rose living room, if any of us went to visit her after school, we would just have to walk down. Her living room was not that big, but it almost always had a quilt frame in there. And women sitting around, I think from the Ladies' Aid Society, I don't know who else. Some were family, some were not, and they were making quilts. And I don't have any idea how many quilts they gave away. Betty says, my sister Betty, that is 2.5 years younger than I am, she says that sometimes when Grandma wasn't around, she would crawl underneath that frame and she would sneak a stitch or 2. I don't know if Grandma ever noticed it or if it just blended in, but that's kind of her memories there. So this church has precious memories. My sister Myrna Summers and my sister Bobby lived here, were married here in this church, and still got a little bit of a smell of the old of this church. Anyway, I just love this quilt. We've had it hanging in 2 of our homes, and I probably haven't taken as good a care of it as I should have. I did have it professionally cleaned about 8 years ago, and it hasn't been out of the plastic much before then, but it is treasured, and I'm afraid my daughter and my granddaughter have got dibs on it, so I won't be donating it. By the way, when Eileen moved to Tennessee a few years ago to live with her family, her sons and daughters, she only took 2 suitcases because she went on a plane. So her daughter, Deborah, inherited everything. And so I'm really glad that Deborah thought about giving this to you, and I'm really glad to see it too. This is just a little bit of information about our family. 5 of my 10 siblings have died within the past 3 years. And at this point, 3 of them are terminal, which means that I'm the only sister in Oregon still living, and my brother George Andrews is the only brother, although he's had a major stroke, but I am believing with the Lord's help that he is getting better. On a happier note, Rochelle is not here. Okay, Lois, I just remembered that Rochelle and I were Crawfish Festival princesses the same year in high school. But we had a rough time because when we went to Tualatin grade school, I was in the very first class, and Rochelle was too. They split us. Part of us went to Sherwood High School, part of us went to Tigard High School. And so, it's almost like Tigard and Sherwood were rivals. So we didn't really see much of each other. So it was fun to see Rochelle do her little ballet, I remember, as she did her program to become queen. And I think I did some sort of a crazy reading. But neither one of us got the queen, but we were there. When my sister sister Linda died in Newburgh, she had this. I don't even think it's been dusted. She had this, and her husband gave it to me. This is Grandma Rose. And this is either Auntie Bella or Mom. It might be Auntie Bella. And this is Callie. Callie was born unable to walk or to feed herself, and so she had to be carried all around. She looks like a really sweet girl, and I think she didn't live much more than 10. Do you know when she died? I don't think she lived much more than 10, but she was, huh? A little older. 13 maybe then. Yeah. Okay, so, and then after she was born, then Arlene Stites was the last of the 4 daughters. And so that's kind of the story. And Rose just had a heart for everybody, and she just did so much for the community. And I think at her funeral, the pastor here called her the salt of the earth. Mm-hmm. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to talk about a couple of quilts now that are owned by Lois Roby, who can't be here today, but they were made by her grandmother, Grandma Higi. And this one, this one was made in 1882. So this is the oldest quilt that we have here in the show. In the corner near April is the date embroidered, 1882. It looks in remarkable condition for being 140 years old. And Grandma Higi, or Lois, the owner, had it evaluated a few years ago, and by, I think that's a conservator who evaluates objects, and she said that yes, the 1882 is probably correct because she had a book on cloth from the 1800s, and she found a photo of this cloth. It's a very tiny floral print in this green, but so that was an interesting quilt. And then there's one over here that Grandma Higi also made. This is a wool quilt, and the story is that Grandma Higi was married and had 4 young children, and her husband worked, but he was in a terrible fire, and he was badly burned. Lois remembers how shiny the skin on his face and his arms was because of the burns. So for several months, he couldn't work at anything. And then after that, there were only certain jobs he could do. So Grandma Higi had to bring an income to the family. And so she made, for a time, she made men's jackets and suits, and this was in the late 1800s. So this quilt was probably made around 1897, Lois believes. And so as she was making the men's suits out of wool, she would have lots of scraps, so she ended up making this quilt and at least one more that they used in the home. And it was used upstairs in the attic in Cleveland, Ohio, in their home. And of course, the winters were very cold. It was an unfinished attic. So they would have to, I think Lois had to heat a brick and put it in a bag and carry it upstairs to put in the bedding to keep warm. And she said this quilt that she slept under was just so comfortable because it was thin, just has a backing on it. So it's very lightweight, but it's very warm because of all the wool. We have Lois Martinazzi here today, and you're going to talk about 2 quilts.
Well, this quilt was made in 1916. And 1916 is a really important year for the Tualatin area. The house that was built in, that was made in, is the Guyberger house, which is still standing on Sagart Street, where the old school was. It just go down that street, and it's still standing. And the Guybergers the ladies got together and made this quilt. And I don't know what the pattern is, but anyway, in 1916, what happened in Tualatin, while these ladies were quilting on this, they were chattering away about what had just happened on Tualatin-Sherwood Road. Anybody know what that would be? The murder? Yes, the double murder, which is a big story. And you can read about it in our book, and the house that it happened in, the one murder, is still standing, and I think the city is going to take it out. Yeah, it has to move because the road is widening. But that was the really big thing. And my dad told me before he died, 2 things he says, when you write your history, I had no idea. He said, don't forget the double murder in 1916 and the blowing up of the dam. And I remember those. But anyway, this is a really precious quilt. And I don't know how long ago it was. We were meeting over at the Senior Center of the Historical Society, and this man came, Guyberger, and brought the quilt and donated it to us. And one of the Guyberger's boys was, probably his father, was a really good friend of my dad's. And in fact, my dad was delivering the afternoon journal on his horse, Toby, and when the murder, after the murder had happened, they were looking for the second guy who had been killed. And you read about it in my book. And this Guyberger kid ran out and said, Art, they found the body. It's up in Stafford. So Dad threw his paper, said, deliver these, and whipped Toby into a gallop and ran up there and was there when the sheriff came out of the body, out of the woods, because it was a hot day, been there for 2 weeks, and it was pretty smelly. But anyway, this quilt is very significant to Tualatin. I'm really, really happy that we have it back here. Now, the other quilt I want to talk about is this one. This is my mother's Depression quilt. The Depression was pretty hard, and I don't think we're all too young to remember. Well, I remember somewhat, but how difficult life was. My mom and dad lived on a farm, incredible hard work, and so poor. And my mother had a rag bag. And you know, when clothes were too old to be worn anymore, she would put the pieces in this bag. And then when she had spare time, which wasn't very often, she would get out her little rag bag, and she had little tiny cardboard pieces that were this is octagon, hexagon. And this is called Grandmother's Flower Garden, the pattern. We used to, when we were kids, we used to say, oh, that was my dress, that was my dress. You know, we're familiar with quite a bit of it. Mom, it's all hand. Of course, it's all hand done. You can see the little tiny stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9. My gosh, I can remember her cutting with her whisk scissors, which were good scissors. One of my sisters got them. I can remember her, you know, running her needle. She would just like that, real sharp needles. Later, she sewed for we kids on a Singer sewing machine, treadle sewing machine. She made all of our clothes. Mother's life was hard. She was a newspaper reporter, and she and my dad wrote. Mom wrote it, but Dad helped her with the stories of in 1959 of the Tualatin's oldest inhabitants. So they went around and talked to people, and Mom wrote those stories that are still fascinating, and it was the beginning of the Tualatin Historical Society. Now, there's something else I want to say about this quilt. When Mom passed away, Dad had us all come over, our sisters, 5 of us, and we got to pick out some of Mother's things. And so we kind of, look, do we want this? Do we want, you know? This fell to me, and I was very happy to get it. I lost out on something else on the Arrowhead pictures, but I got this, and I was really happy about it. But it was just a quilt top. She never finished it, and it's like I think she finished all the pieces, but she never put a back on it or finished it. And gosh, I'd had it for quite a while, and it was just a piece of cloth, you know, in the closet, folded up. And I had a good friend one time who told me that her mother-in-law did quilting. And I said, do you suppose she would quilt this quilt for me? And she said, well, I'll ask her. And so she said she would, yeah. And she lived kind of in close to Oswego, kind of Stafford and Oswego. And she quilted it, and she put the backing on it, which is yellow. And she quilted it by hand. And, you know, the finished it's really quite charming, you know, if you can see those little things. I have it on a quilt rack. I don't have it on a bed. So my friend asked me later, she says, I think I paid her, I don't know what it was, but I was very, very happy with it. And my friend asked me later, she said, Lois, what was your mother's maiden name? And I said, Chapman. She said, my mother-in-law went to school with her. So the woman that quilted my mother's quilt went to high school with her. And I think that's pretty wonderful. This is going to go to one of my granddaughters, and who I know will cherish it. My daughter, back in Michigan, also is a quilter, and at first I was going to give it to her, but she's got lots of quilts, and I'm going to give this to another granddaughter. And I almost cry when I look at it, because thinking of how hard my mother worked and how hard her life was. I love the quilt.
Thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a quilt up here that was finished by Chris Nyberg-Tunstall. I think this is called the Grandmother's Fan, or Fan's Quilt. And Chris's mother-in-law lived in Portland for a time, and her friend and neighbor, Mrs. Loftquist, had started this quilt around 1940. But she made most of it, but she couldn't finish it, so she passed it on to the mother-in-law, and then Chris eventually got it. And so Chris wanted to finish it, and she had to look 2 years to find, I guess, the right kind of color of the muslin and the green fabric, she said. And she worked really hard on it. She had help from the owner of the Pine Needle fabric store in Lake Oswego, who helped her decide on a trim and binding. But so Chris says that there are about 560 pieces, and of course most of those are the pieces of the fan. And she had a nice little story to tell about making this quilt. She said, I learned an important quilt making lesson when adding the unfinished squares to Mrs. Loftquist's quilt, or quilt top. I cut each of the squares 1/8 of an inch larger than the ones that she made. After I hand sewed them along the long edge of the quilt, it was more than 1 inch longer than the other side of the quilt. I had to take out all of the hand stitching, recut the squares the exact size of the originals, and restitch it back together. As I recall, it was one of the few times I ever cried. And I'll show you one more quilt here that is in our collection here at the Heritage Center. This one was made in 1994 here in Tualatin by a group of women who were members of a crafters guild. And they made it for the Historical Society with, pictures of buildings and scenes and icons of the Tualatin area. This was the train depot here in Tualatin. Right over here. Oh, where the tracks are still. I don't know. This says a 1922 Chevrolet. I don't know if that's
Can I say one other thing?
Oh, sure. Here.
I've got a thing. That's okay.
I think you should. I think you should tell about this one.
Oh,
because you know
no,
that.
well, anyway, that's a train station. Went in 1889, and behind it, see, there's a big tree. Behind it is the first church, Congregational Church.
And then whose barn at the top?
It's
in
a
the
Nyberg
center?
barn.
The Nyberg barn, and of course that's gone now. And then the little house below that.
I believe that's the, oh gosh, first guy was here, Byram House,
Byram.
Edward Byram House.
Oh, mm-hmm. Still exists. And yes, the Byram house is still here. I'm not sure where in town. And then that's this building we're in, which was the church for decades, the only church. And then I think this is just representing the forest around. And then this is the Davis house with, and it says it's Del Judy here. So
Yeah.
Del made this square.
I think she did.
That house still exists
Yes.
off of Sagert Street.
Yeah.
Okay, and it says heritage trees, a maple and a black walnut. And this is, you probably know, a lot of you, this is the Grange building that's still here. And it says country store, so I'm not sure which store, if that was.
I think that's where the Giro place is now.
Okay. On Boone's Ferry. And then the Fredericks house, I don't know that one. I don't know where that would have been.
It's down at the end of Nyberg Lane, down by Browns Ferry Park.
Okay.
Just to the
Oh,
north, or
and
to the
is
south.
it still there?
No.
Okay. And then, of course, the Christmas tree, there was a large evergreen tree across the street, across Boone's Ferry from the brick store that was always decorated at holiday time by the fire department. So this quilt, when this quilt was made for the Historical Society, we didn't have this building, and so it was hung in the library here in Tualatin for a while until we were able to move it here to the center, to the Heritage Center. So I think Eleanor, you are, I believe, the next person to show your quilts.
This one was found at an antique shop in Rockaway Beach, and I was lucky enough, my daughters, we were on a trip over there, and I spotted it, and I thought, oh my gosh, I never see old quilts anywhere. So they distracted me. I was out at the car, and one of them snuck in, and they bought, it was just the top. Oh, thank you. It was just up to here, up to this pale orange, and it was very long and narrow and didn't fit my needs, so I decided I was going to alter it a little bit, and it now fits a twin bed. I put the borders on, and I took one of the rows out and incorporated it into the back, because I felt that these colors were just not, they just kind of clashed. And this is called a scrappy quilt. As you can see, it's a lot of, somebody just used a lot of, and we did find fabrics in here that are like from the 40s. There's some, what is that, this piqué fabric, and there really is a method to this madness. I don't mean to be uncomplimentary, but they do have blocks, and I just cut this out so that people could see that this lady assembled a block, or man, because there are men quilters, and this is the piqué fabric. And I remember wearing that like in the 40s or 50s. I would have piqué clothing. And then there's also some seersucker, and some of these prints are clearly from the 40s, and maybe others, I mean, because people accumulate clothing and fabric and then they assemble it. So that was that one, the practical use of it, so that I could use it for a bedspread. And then I got lucky on the other coast, visiting my granddaughter in Connecticut and going to a flea market, and lo and behold, I find another quilt. I hardly ever find, as I say, I never find them. So this apparently is a child's crib quilt or something. Now my little great-granddaughter, she played on it on the floor in my living room. And it's, this one is the opposite of scrappy. I mean, it is scrappy, but it's done with this all over, let's see, there's a name for it, a whole quilt design, where it's just like one gigantic block that we use in making quilts. So this is just how I found it. $5, what a bargain. I couldn't believe it. So that's my happy thing. It's got a pretty back too. Obviously a child's print. So those are my two other people's grandma's quilt. And this too has some old fabric in it, 40s and 50s and thereabouts. So that's it.
Beautiful. Well, we have one more quilt to show you, and this is April Wicker, who has done a lot of the planning for this program, and we're so glad to have her.
I wanted to close out the program with a very modern quilt. Now, we looked at this one that has all the handmade pictures. I printed pictures on fabric that is prepared for printing. You run it through your printer just like any other piece of paper, and you get pictures that you can sew into projects like a quilt. So I made this quilt after my dad's 85th birthday, and it has pictures of his parents, all of his children and grandchildren, his 2 wives. I made it and packaged it up real nicely and handed it to him, and he started opening it. And about halfway through, he says, "Oh, it's my life." So this quilt has been named It's My Life. One of the things that we do nowadays that our forebears didn't do very well is we make sure we label our quilts so we know who made them, when they were made, and then we don't have to guess, well, was that my grandmother or was it a friend of hers, or, you know. This way we know who made the quilt, when it was made, and what the purpose of it was. So this, like I said, is very modern. I was thinking these were more like attic windows blocks, but it is kind of a modified log cabin because I don't have, if it was a attic windows, it would have a diagonal seam right here. So it looks like a window frame. So this is more of a log cabin quilt. But yeah, feel free to look at it real up close.
Thank you. Yes, Yvonne reminded me that April participated in a panel that we had in a program back in May around Memorial Day, and she is a veteran, and she was one of 4 veterans on our stage who talked about her experiences. So thank you, April. So that's our program. We just have a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, otherwise we can chat after the program. But thank you all for coming. Thank you to the donors we have 3 quilts in our collection now, and thank you to those of you who loaned your quilts and for us to enjoy. So that's our program.